It was a Tuesday like any other, or so I thought. The soft autumn breeze rustled through the curtains of our suburban home in Springfield, carrying with it the scent of Mrs. Johnson's roses from next door. I, Sarah Thompson, was engrossed in my work-from-home routine, fingers flying across the keyboard as I tried to meet a pressing deadline for my marketing job. The clock on my desk read 2:37 p.m. when the silence was shattered by an insistent, almost angry buzzing of the doorbell. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was probably just another package delivery. But the ringing continued, growing more frantic with each passing second. "Coming," I called out, my voice tinged with annoyance as I saved my work and pushed away from the desk. As I made my way down the hallway, the ringing intensified, as if the person on the other side could sense my approach and was determined to make their presence known. I smoothed down my messy ponytail and straightened my oversized sweater, trying to look somewhat presentable. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and swung it open, ready to politely dismiss whatever salesperson or religious enthusiast awaited me. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight that greeted me. There, on my front porch, stood my mother-in-law, Barbara Wilson. Her steel-gray hair was disheveled, her usually impeccable makeup slightly smudged, and her eyes held a wild, determined look that sent a chill down my spine. But what truly caught my attention were the numerous suitcases and boxes piled around her feet, as if she was moving her entire life onto our doorstep. "Be Barbara?" I stammered, my mind struggling to process the scene before me. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Without so much as a hello, Barbara fixed me with a steely gaze and declared, "I'm moving in." Her voice brooked no argument as she continued, "And don't you dare try to stop me, Sarah. I have every right to be here." Before I could formulate a response, she pushed past me, dragging a large suitcase behind her. The wheels caught on the threshold, and I instinctively reached out to help, only to have my hand swatted away. "I can manage just fine," Barbara snapped, finally maneuvering the suitcase into the foyer. She turned back to me, hands on her hips. "Well, are you just going to stand there gawking, or are you going to help me bring in the rest of my things?" I blinked, feeling as if I had stepped into some bizarre alternate reality. "Barbara," I began cautiously, "I don't understand. Why are you moving in? Did something happen? Does John know about this?" At the mention of my husband's name, Barbara's expression softened slightly, but the determination in her eyes remained. "John understands. He knows I need to be here. But he's not even home," I protested weakly. "He's been on a business trip for the past 3 days and won't be back for another week." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "Details. Now, are you going to help me or not?" Still in shock, I found myself mechanically walking out to her car, a sleek silver sedan that was packed to the brim with more boxes and bags. As I lifted a particularly heavy box, my mind raced with questions. Why was Barbara here? Why now? And why hadn't John mentioned anything about this? For the next hour, we worked in tense silence, moving Barbara's belongings into our home. With each trip, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if my carefully constructed life was being dismantled piece by piece. Finally, when the last bag was brought in, I collapsed onto the living room sofa, my body aching and my mind reeling. Barbara stood in the center of the room, surveying her handiwork with a satisfied nod. "Well," she said, clapping her hands together, "I think that's everything. Now, where's the guest room? I assume that's where I'll be staying." I gaped at her, still struggling to find my voice. "Barbara," I managed at last, "we can't just. I mean, you can't just move in without any warning. We need to talk about this. We need to call John." Barbara's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Listen here, Sarah," she said, her voice low and threatening, "I am John's mother. I have every right to be here, and you have no right to question me. Do you understand?" I felt a flicker of anger ignite within me, cutting through the shock. "No, I don't understand," I said, standing up to face her. "This is my home too, and I have a say in who lives here. We need to discuss this like adults." For a moment, I thought Barbara might explode with rage. But then, to my surprise, she deflated slightly. "Fine," she said, her voice weary. "We'll talk. But not now. I'm tired from the drive, and I need to rest. We'll discuss this in the morning." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed one of her suitcases and marched down the hallway towards the guest room, leaving me standing alone in a living room that suddenly felt foreign and hostile. As the sound of the guest room door slamming echoed through the house, I sank back onto the sofa, my head in my hands. John was away on business, unreachable for another week. I was alone, facing a situation I never could have imagined. How had a normal Tuesday afternoon turned into this nightmare? And more importantly, what was I going to do now? The next morning, I awoke to the unsettling realization that yesterday's events weren't just a bizarre dream. The sound of pots and pans clanging in the kitchen confirmed that Barbara was indeed in our house, making herself at home. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, gathering my courage to face what promised to be a challenging day. As I padded into the kitchen, the aroma of coffee filled the air. Barbara stood at the stove, her back to me, humming tunelessly as she flipped pancakes. "Good morning, Sarah," she said without turning around. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of making breakfast. Heaven knows you could use some decent food in this house." I bit back a retort, reminding myself to stay calm. "Good morning, Barbara. Listen, I think we need to talk about coffee," she interrupted, thrusting a mug into my hands. "Now, sit down. These pancakes are almost ready." Feeling increasingly frustrated, I sat at the kitchen table, watching as Barbara bustled around, acting as if she owned the place. When she finally joined me, placing a stack of admittedly delicious-looking pancakes between us, I took a deep breath and tried again. "Barbara, about you moving in. I really think we need to discuss this. I tried calling John last night, but it went straight to voicemail. I'm not comfortable with this situation, and I think it's only fair that Sarah." Barbara cut me off, her tone sharp. "I've already told you, I have every right to be here. I'm John's mother, and this is as much my home as it is yours." I felt my temper rising. "Actually, it's not. This is John and my home. We bought it together, we pay the mortgage, and we make decisions about it together. You can't just show up and declare that you're moving in without any discussion." Barbara's eyes narrowed. "I see. So this is how you treat family? By turning them away in their time of need?" "Time of need?" I echoed, confused. "Barbara, what's going on? Has something happened?" For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by her usual steely determination. "That's none of your concern," she snapped. "The point is, I'm here now, and I'm staying. John will back me up on this, you'll see." Frustration bubbled up inside me. "But we need to talk to John together. This isn't a decision you can make unilaterally." Barbara stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm done discussing this. I'm going to unpack my things and get settled in the guest room." As she stormed off, I sat there, feeling utterly helpless. I tried John's cell phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. I left what felt like my 100th message, pleading with him to call me back as soon as possible. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tension and awkward encounters. I tried to work, but my concentration was shattered by the constant sounds of Barbara moving around the house, opening and closing drawers, and muttering to herself. Around midday, I ventured into the guest room to check on her progress. What I saw made my jaw drop. The room had been completely transformed. Barbara had rearranged the furniture, hung her own curtains, and was in the process of taking down the artwork John and I had carefully chosen. "Barbara!" I exclaimed. "What are you doing?" She turned to me, a picture frame in her hands. "Oh, Sarah. This room needed a woman's touch. Those paintings you had up were dreadful. No taste at all." I felt my face flush with anger. "Those were wedding gifts from our friends. You can't just take them down without asking." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. This is my room now, and I'll decorate it as I see fit." I opened my mouth to argue further, but the futility of it all suddenly hit me. What was the point? Barbara clearly had no intention of listening to reason. I turned on my heel and left the room, feeling like a stranger in my own home. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself retreating to my home office, the only space that still felt like mine. But even there, I couldn't escape Barbara's presence. Every so often, she'd pop her head in, offering unsolicited advice on how I should organize my desk or suggesting improvements to my work setup. By evening, I was at my wits' end. I decided to order takeout for dinner, hoping to minimize any further interactions with Barbara. But as I was placing the order, she appeared in the doorway of my office. "Takeout," she scoffed. "Really, Sarah? I thought I'd cook us a proper meal tonight. I brought some of my special recipes with me." I closed my eyes, counting to 10 silently before responding. "That's kind of you, Barbara. But I've already ordered. Maybe another night?" She pursed her lips disapprovingly but didn't argue further. Small victories, I thought to myself. Dinner was a tense affair, eaten in near silence at the dining room table. Barbara kept shooting disapproving glances at my takeout containers, while I pushed my food around my plate, my appetite long gone. As I was clearing the table, Barbara cleared her throat. "Sarah, dear, I couldn't help but notice that your linen closet is in a dreadful state. I thought I might reorganize it tomorrow. And perhaps we could discuss repainting the living room? That color you've chosen is so dreary." I froze, a plate suspended halfway to the sink. The audacity of her suggestions made my blood boil. I turned to face her, struggling to keep my voice level. "Barbara," I said slowly, "I appreciate that you want to help, but this is our home. John and I like it the way it is. We don't need you to reorganize or redecorate anything." Her face hardened. "I see. So this is how it's going to be. You're going to fight me on everything?" "I'm not fighting you," I protested. "I'm just asking you to respect our space and our choices." Barbara stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I knew it," she hissed. "You've never liked me, have you? Always trying to come between John and me. Well, let me tell you something, Missy. I raised that boy, and I know what's best for him. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not the right woman for him after all." With that parting shot, she stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, shocked and hurt. I heard the guest room door slam shut, the sound echoing through the suddenly too quiet house. I sank into a chair, feeling utterly drained. How had things escalated so quickly? And where was John in all of this? I checked my phone again, but there were no missed calls or messages from him. As I sat there in the dimly lit dining room, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Barbara had made it clear she had no intention of leaving, and I was at a loss for how to handle the situation. The home that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a battleground, and I was woefully unprepared for the war that was brewing. With a heavy heart, I finished cleaning up and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, how long could I endure this? And more importantly, whose side would John take when he finally returned? The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread weighing heavily on my chest. The events of the past 2 days felt like a surreal nightmare, but the muffled sounds of Barbara moving around the house confirmed that this was, indeed, my new reality. I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that John had finally returned my calls or messages. Nothing. The screen remained stubbornly blank, save for the time, 7:15 a.m. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for another day of tension and confrontation. As I got dressed, I decided that today would be different. Today, I would get answers. I couldn't continue living in this limbo, with Barbara taking over my home and John seemingly oblivious to the chaos unfolding in his absence. Determined, I marched into the kitchen, only to find Barbara already there, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper as if she'd lived here for years. "Good morning, Sarah," she said without looking up. "I made some coffee. I hope you don't mind that I used the good beans. The ones you usually use are simply dreadful." I bit back a retort, reminding myself of my mission. "Barbara, we need to talk about John." She lowered the newspaper, her eyes narrowing. "What about John? I've been trying to reach him since you arrived, but he's not answering his phone or responding to my messages. Don't you think that's strange? He's on a business trip, not unreachable in the Amazon rainforest." Barbara waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how he gets when he's focused on work. I'm sure he's just busy." Her nonchalant attitude only fueled my suspicion. But don't you find it odd that he hasn't even acknowledged that his mother has suddenly moved into our house? Wouldn't that warrant at least a quick phone call? For a split second, I saw a flicker of something worry, guilt, in Barbara's eyes, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Sarah, dear, she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, I've known John his entire life. This is perfectly normal behavior for him. Now, why don't you stop fretting and have some breakfast? I ignored her suggestion. I'm going to try calling him again, I said, pulling out my phone. As I dialed John's number, I watched Barbara out of the corner of my eye. She seemed unusually interested in my call, her eyes fixed on me as the phone rang. Once again, it went straight to voicemail. John, it's me again, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I really need to talk to you. Your mother is here, and, well, we need to discuss some things. Please call me back as soon as you can. I ended the call and turned to Barbara. Don't you think it's strange that his phone keeps going straight to voicemail? What if something's happened to him? Barbara's laugh was a little too forced. Don't be ridiculous, Sarah. John is perfectly fine. He probably just turned off his phone to focus on his meetings. You really do worry too much. Her dismissive attitude only strengthened my resolve. I spent the next few hours alternating between trying to work and attempting to reach John through every means possible. I called his office, but his assistant informed me he was in meetings all day. I emailed him, both his personal and work accounts. I even tried messaging some of his colleagues on LinkedIn, asking if they'd heard from him. By mid-afternoon, my frustration had reached a boiling point. I stormed into the living room, where Barbara was calmly watching a cooking show. Barbara, I need answers, I demanded. Why are you really here? And why isn't John surprised or concerned about your sudden appearance? She muted the TV and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. I've already told you, Sarah. I'm here because I have every right to be. As for John, I'm sure he'll contact you when he's ready. Her cryptic response only fueled my suspicions. When he's ready? What does that mean? Barbara, if you know something about John that I don't, you need to tell me right now. For a moment, I thought I saw a crack in her composed facade. But then she stood up, drawing herself to her full height. I don't appreciate your tone, young lady. I am not obligated to explain myself to you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll take a nap. As she brushed past me, I caught a whiff of her perfume, the same scent that had been lingering on some of John's clothes lately. A scent I had attributed to his dry cleaning, but now, my mind was racing. There was more to this story than Barbara was letting on, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. That night, after another tense and silent dinner, I waited until I heard Barbara's bedroom door close. Then, heart pounding, I crept down the hallway to the guest room. I knew what I was about to do was a violation of privacy, but I felt I had no choice. I needed answers. Slowly, carefully, I turned the doorknob and slipped into the room. The streetlight filtering through the curtains provided just enough illumination for me to make out the shapes of Barbara's belongings. I moved quietly, my eyes scanning for anything that might provide a clue. As I rifled through her bags, guilt and determination warred within me. This wasn't like me, I'd never been the type to snoop or invade someone's privacy. But the past few days had pushed me to my limits, and I felt like I was fighting for my home, my marriage, my very sanity. Just as I was about to give up, my hand brushed against something in the bottom of a suitcase. I pulled it out, a stack of envelopes, held together with a rubber band. My heart racing, I slipped them into the pocket of my robe and quickly put everything back the way I'd found it. Back in the safety of my bedroom, I spread the envelopes out on the bed. Most of them were official-looking documents, bank statements, legal notices, things I couldn't make sense of in the dim light. But one envelope caught my eye. It was addressed to Barbara, but the return address made my blood run cold. It was from John, postmarked 3 weeks ago. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. As I read, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Dear Mom, it began. I know we've discussed this before, but I think it's time. Sarah and I have been having problems, and I could really use your support. I think it would be best if you came to stay with us for a while. I haven't told Sarah yet, you know how she can be. I think it's better if we present it as a fait accompli. I'll be away on a business trip when you arrive, which should give you time to get settled in before I return. Thank you for always being there for me. Love, John. I read the letter once, twice, 3 times, unable to believe the words in front of me. John had invited his mother to move in without consulting me. He thought we were having problems. And what did he mean by you know how she can be? The room seemed to spin around me as the implications of the letter sank in. John and Barbara had planned this, behind my back. They had conspired to upend my life, to invade my home, without so much as a word to me. As the initial shock wore off, a new emotion began to take its place: anger. How dare they? How could John do this to me? And how could Barbara act so innocent, pretending she had just shown up out of the blue? I sat on the edge of the bed, the letter clutched in my hand, as the first rays of dawn began to peek through the curtains. I hadn't slept a wink, my mind too busy processing this betrayal and trying to figure out what to do next. One thing was clear: things couldn't continue as they were. It was time for a confrontation, time for the truth to come out. As I heard Barbara stirring in the guest room, I steeled myself for the battle ahead. Today, I would get answers, no matter what it took. With the morning light streaming through the windows, I sat at the kitchen table, the pile of letters spread out before me. My hands trembled slightly as I sorted through them, each envelope revealing a new piece of the puzzle that was Barbara's sudden appearance in our lives. The first letter I opened was a foreclosure notice from a bank I didn't recognize. My eyes widened as I read the details. Barbara's house, the one she'd lived in for over 30 years, was being repossessed due to missed mortgage payments. The amount owed was staggering, far more than I would have imagined possible for a modest suburban home. "Oh, Barbara," I whispered to myself, a mix of shock and unexpected sympathy washing over me. "What have you gotten yourself into?" The next envelope contained a credit card statement. The balance due made me gasp audibly. It was more than John and I made in a year. As I scanned the list of charges, a pattern emerged. There were numerous payments to companies with names like Golden Opportunity Investments and Wealth Builders International. My heart sank as I realized what I was looking at. Barbara, my headstrong, opinionated mother-in-law, had fallen victim to a pyramid scheme. The next few letters confirmed my suspicions: urgent notices from these companies, promising incredible returns if she just invested a little more, warning of the dire consequences if she tried to back out now. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions: anger at Barbara for being so foolish, pity for her desperate situation, and a growing sense of dread about what this meant for our family. As I continued to sift through the papers, the full extent of Barbara's financial ruin became clear. She hadn't just lost her house, she had drained her retirement savings, maxed out multiple credit cards, and even taken out personal loans to fuel her ill-fated investments. But it was the last letter in the pile that truly shook me to my core. Unlike the others, this one was handwritten, on John's personal stationery. With a sense of trepidation, I began to read: "Dear Mom, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, and I want you to know that I understand the difficult position you're in. I'm sorry that things have gotten so out of hand with your investments. I wish you had come to me sooner, but I understand why you didn't. I've spoken with Sarah about the possibility of you staying with us for a while, and she's on board with the idea. We both agree that family needs to stick together during tough times. I think it would be best if you came to stay with us as soon as possible. We can help you get back on your feet and figure out a plan to deal with your debts. Don't worry about bringing everything. We can store some of your things in our garage until we figure out a more permanent solution. Just pack what you need for now. I love you, Mom. We'll get through this together. Your son, John." I read the letter once, twice, 3 times, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. John had lied to me. He had known about Barbara's financial troubles all along. He had invited her to stay with us, claiming that I was on board with the idea when he had never even mentioned it to me. The betrayal cut deep. I felt like the ground beneath my feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. How long had John known about this? How could he have kept something so significant from me? And why did he feel the need to lie about my involvement? As I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of Barbara's financial ruin and John's deception, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The shock and anger were still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but they were overshadowed by a sense of clarity. For the first time since Barbara had shown up on our doorstep, I felt like I understood what was really going on. I glanced at the clock. It was just past 7 a.m. Barbara would be waking up soon, if she wasn't already awake. I knew I needed to confront her, to get the full story directly from her. But first, I needed to talk to John. With a deep breath, I picked up my phone and dialed John's number. To my surprise, it rang this time instead of going straight to voicemail. After 4 rings, I heard his voice. "Sarah, is everything okay?" He sounded groggy, as if I'd woken him up. "No, John, everything is not okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I know about your mother's financial troubles. I know you invited her to stay with us without talking to me first. I found your letter." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When John spoke again, his voice was low and defeated. "Sarah, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I cut him off. "But right now, I need you to listen. Your mother is here, living in our house. She's been here for days, John. Days. And you haven't returned my calls or messages. Do you have any idea what I've been going through?" "I'm sorry," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you'd be angry." "Angry?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "John, I'm beyond angry. I'm hurt. I'm betrayed. How could you keep this from me? We're supposed to be partners. We're supposed to make decisions like this together." "I know," he said. "I messed up. I didn't know what else to do. Mom was in trouble, and I felt like I had to help her. And you didn't think I would understand that?" I asked, my voice rising. "You didn't think I would want to help her too? John, she's family. Of course I would have wanted to help. But this sneaking around, this lying, that's not okay." There was another long pause. "You're right," John finally said. "I handled this all wrong. I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am. What can I do to make this right?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. "For starters, you can come home. Now. Not in a week, not when your business trip is over. Now. We need to deal with this situation as a family, and that means you need to be here." "Okay," John said, sounding relieved to have a concrete action to take. "I'll book the first flight home. I should be able to get there by this evening." "Good," I said. "And John, when you get here, we're going to have a long talk about trust and honesty in our marriage. This can't happen again." "I understand," he said softly. "I love you, Sarah." I hesitated for a moment before responding. "I love you too, John. But right now, that love is being tested in ways I never imagined it would be. Just get home safe, okay?" After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table for a few more minutes, gathering my thoughts and steeling myself for the conversation I knew I needed to have with Barbara. As if on cue, I heard her bedroom door open and her footsteps in the hallway. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, the letters still spread out on the table in front of me. It was time for the truth to come out, once and for all. As Barbara entered the kitchen, her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the letters, my determined stance, the mix of emotions playing across my face. "Sarah," she said, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "What's going on?" I met her gaze steadily. "Barbara, we need to talk. About everything. No more secrets, no more lies. It's time for the truth." The confrontation with Barbara had been intense, filled with tears, accusations, and finally, a grudging understanding. We had talked for hours, laying bare the full extent of her financial troubles and the deception that had brought her to our doorstep. By the time John arrived home that evening, both Barbara and I were emotionally exhausted but had reached a tentative truce. As I lay in bed that night, John sleeping fitfully beside me after our own difficult conversation, I found myself staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The events of the past few days played on repeat in my head, each replay bringing with it a new realization, a new perspective on my life and my relationships. Sleep eluded me, and as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I made a decision. Quietly, careful not to wake John, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the guest room, now Barbara's room. I knocked softly, then entered when I heard her muffled come in. Barbara was already awake, sitting up in bed with a book in her lap. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, the weight of her troubles etched into the lines of her face. "Sarah," she said, her voice tinged with surprise and a hint of wariness. "Is everything all right?" I took a deep breath. "No, Barbara. Everything is not all right. But I think I know what I need to do to make it right." Over the next hour, as the house slowly came to life around us, I laid out my plan. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Barbara's eyes flashed with her old stubbornness, but in the end, she agreed. It was, we both realized, the only way forward. When John finally emerged from our bedroom, bleary-eyed and clearly dreading the day ahead, he found Barbara and me in the kitchen, drinking coffee in a silence that was no longer hostile, but thoughtful. "John," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my heart, "we need to talk." What followed was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I explained to John that while I understood his desire to help his mother, the way he had gone about it had shaken the very foundation of our marriage. The lies, the secrecy, the unilateral decisions, they had all contributed to a breach of trust that I wasn't sure could be easily repaired. "I love you, John," I said, my voice breaking slightly despite my resolve to stay strong. "But I can't continue in a relationship where I'm not treated as an equal partner. Where decisions that affect both of our lives are made without my input or consent." John's face crumpled, a mix of guilt, fear, and regret washing over his features. "Sarah, please," he began, reaching for my hand across the table. "I know I messed up. I'll do anything to make this right." I gently pulled my hand away. "I believe you mean that, John. But the truth is, I think we both need some time to figure out what we really want, and who we really are, both as individuals and as a couple." Barbara, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout our exchange, finally spoke up. "This is all my fault," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If I hadn't gotten myself into this mess, if I hadn't agreed to John's plan." I turned to her, my expression softening slightly. "No, Barbara. Your financial troubles may have been the catalyst, but the issues in my marriage with John have been there for a while. We just never confronted them head on." Taking another deep breath, I continued, "That's why I've decided to leave for a while." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. John's face paled, and Barbara gasped softly. "Leave?" John echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, leave?" "I mean that I need some time and space to think, to process everything that's happened," I explained. "I've already called my sister. She's agreed to let me stay with her for a while." But what about us?" John asked, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "What about our marriage?" I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw the man I had fallen in love with, but I also saw the man who had betrayed my trust, who had made decisions about our life without consulting me. And I realized that I needed to figure out if those two men could coexist in my heart. "I don't know, John," I said honestly. "I don't know what this means for our marriage in the long term. But I do know that if we have any chance of moving forward, we both need to do some serious soul-searching." Turning to Barbara, I added, "And you, Barbara, you need to take responsibility for your actions and start rebuilding your life. John and we can't fix this for you. You need to do that yourself." Barbara nodded slowly, a look of determination replacing the guilt in her eyes. "You're right, Sarah. I've been running from my problems for too long. It's time I faced them head on." Over the next few hours, we hammered out a plan. Barbara would stay in our house for another month, giving her time to explore her options and start the process of untangling her financial mess. John would help her research credit counseling services and look into possible part-time jobs. And I would pack my bags and leave that afternoon. As I stood in our bedroom, methodically folding clothes and placing them in my suitcase, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course. This was the home John and I had built together, filled with memories both good and bad. But there was also a sense of relief, even excitement. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my life, making a decision that was solely for me. John hovered in the doorway, watching me pack with a look of helpless anguish on his face. "Are you sure about this, Sarah?" he asked for what felt like the 100th time. "Isn't there any other way?" I paused in my packing, turning to face him. "John, I'm not sure about anything right now. That's the point. I need this time to figure out what I want, what I need. And you need to do the same." He nodded slowly, resignation settling over his features. "I understand. I don't like it, but I understand. Just promise me you'll stay in touch. That this isn't goodbye forever." I felt a lump form in my throat. Despite everything, despite the anger and hurt, I still loved this man. "I promise," I said softly. "This isn't goodbye forever. It's just goodbye for now." An hour later, I stood on the front porch, my bags at my feet. John and Barbara stood in the doorway, both looking lost and uncertain. I had called a taxi, not trusting myself to drive in my emotional state. As the taxi pulled up, I turned to them one last time. "Take care of each other," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "And take care of yourselves. We all have a lot of work to do." With that, I picked up my bags and walked towards the taxi. As I settled into the backseat and gave the driver my sister's address, I allowed myself one last look at the house, at John and Barbara still standing in the doorway. Then, taking a deep breath, I turned to face forward. As the taxi pulled away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges I couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in days, perhaps in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever happened next, I knew I was taking the first step towards reclaiming my life, my identity, and my future. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, and with it, the chapter of my life it represented. But ahead of me stretched an open road, full of possibilities. And as the taxi turned the corner, taking me out of sight of my old life, I allowed myself a small smile. This wasn't an ending, I realized. It was a beginning.